All right, so we are at 1 after 1 Eastern time, so we'll get started. Just want to give a big hello and welcome to everyone. It's so great to see participants joining us from all around the world today. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here. On behalf of Contact North, I'm pleased to welcome you to today's webinar, Responsible AI in Higher Education, Balancing Innovation and Sustainability. My name is Sarah Govro. I'm the director of teachonline.ca and the online learning news at Contact North, and I will be your host for this session. I would like to begin with a provincial land acknowledgement. We respectfully acknowledge that Contact North's work and the work of our community partners takes place on traditional Indigenous territories across the province. We are grateful to be able to live and work on these lands. We express our gratitude to the First Nation, Métis, and Inuit peoples who have cared for these territories since time immemorial and who continue to strengthen communities across Ontario. So just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. So we are using Zoom webinar today. That means participants' microphones and cameras will remain off and you won't have access to them. The chat is open, but do remember to select the everyone option in the drop-down menu when posting. And if you have any questions, kindly use the Q&A tool located at the bottom of your screen. We will have time for questions at the end of the session, and you can also upvote any questions that resonate with you by clicking the thumbs up icon. Live captioning is available. To activate it, simply click the closed caption icon at the bottom of the screen. And after the webinar, I will post the recording and presentation slides on teachonline.ca, and I'll share that link in the chat momentarily. And you will also receive a link via email within 24 hours through the Zoom email automated system. Right, that's it from me. Now on to our main event. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Glenda Morgan, EdTech Market Analyst at Phil Hill & Associates. Welcome back, Morgan, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks everybody for coming. I want to start off with a bit of a disclaimer today. So I'm here to talk about responsible AI and ethics, but I'm certainly not an expert on the environment. I'm not an expert on AI, and I'm not an expert on ethics. What I am an expert on is EdTech, and that's the approach that I'll be taking is through the lens of EdTech. How can we think about responsible AI and ethics and the environment? When we talk about AI, just a quick disclaimer, we've got general AI, which is, a group of technologies that essentially mimic a human thinking. And then we've got generative AI. Obviously, since the last couple of years, a lot of higher education and EdTech in particular has been consumed with this new arrival of generative AI and all that it is capable of doing, and struggling with how to try to think about it. Mostly what I'm talking about are things that have happened in the last couple of years, and particularly around the introduction of generative AI. So, after the launch of ChatGPT for popular consumption at the end of 2022, many edtech companies developed approaches to AI ethics or principles for responsible use in AI. And just as some background, that's what sort of gave rise to this webinar that I'm doing at the moment. I wrote a piece in the newsletter that I write for called On EdTech that was critical of some of these things. So I want to sort of go through what they talked about and how they approach it and why we need a better approach. So I just picked a couple of sort of the big ones out there. Blackboard by Anthology, they're one of the leaders in the integration of AI into the learning management system. And they were one of the first to come out with a statement of principles, how they were going to approach AI, trustworthy AI. It's all about accountability, reliability, humans in control, transparency, and so on. I don't want to dwell too much on these. D2L, many of you are in Ontario, you likely will use D2L, used widely around the world. Again, They actually launched a course also on responsible AI, and again stressing things like transparency, accountability, privacy, non-bias, and so on. Moodle, the most widely used learning management system in the world, also came out with their principles, the same sorts of things, human-centered, transparency. They put a particular spin on there in terms of configurability, in terms of their, you can choose which AI you want to use. Top hat, getting away from learning management systems for a bit, the same kinds of things here, humans in the loop, against bias. You're getting the picture. And many edtech companies around the world have adopted principles or codes of ethics around AI. They are all, being guided by that. As a market analyst, one of the things I do a lot is do a lot of vendor briefings, and they always start, let me just talk about our code of ethics from AI. And not only are individual places looking at codes of ethics or principles, but also you've got some industry approaches. So the Council of School Networking Officers has one. There's several out there. One of the others out there is the Software and Information Industries Association. They've got the seven principles. I was a bit amused in constructing this webinar in looking at this because I noticed that one of they convened a committee to come up with these principles, and one of the companies, it was all edtech companies that they engaged in drawing up these principles. One of them is All Here, which was recently in the news. It was an AI company that had sold a product to the Los Angeles school district, but landed up actually going out of business. And there was some press reports about how they had not followed privacy practices, and also there was a question of use of finances and potential criminal prosecution for that. So it perhaps wasn't a great choice in that. But we're seeing all these approaches. In general, they stress the same kinds of things. There's many of them out there, but it's all about privacy, security, transparency, humans in the loop, fairness, but also about educating and informing the users, the stakeholders, all about what responsible use of AI might look like. What none of them do is draw attention to the environmental impact of AI. And that is sort of somewhat surprising. And that was what my original newsletter post, which gave rise to this webinar, sort of was talking about. They're not, nobody is really doing that, even when they're addressing the environment directly. So Instructure, makers of Canvas, one of the other, certainly in North America, the largest LMS in terms of market share. When they were still a public company, they had a environment, society, and governance report addressing the environment directly. And even then, they weren't really talking about the impact of AI on the environment. It's more about things that they're doing to think about the environment, but not really specifically related to AI or thinking about how they could use it in a more responsible way. We do occasionally see um, edtech companies start to talk about AI, but where we do see this, for example, Lightspeed Systems, which is a K-12 edtech company, they're focusing on the positive aspects of AI and the ways that AI can be used to sort of help energy consumption and things like that. Not really talking about, hey, what are we doing here and how is that impacting the environment? Sort of looking at the negative side as well. So, and it's certainly true that AI can help the environment. Certainly there are lots of great examples out there. As I was working on the original post and this webinar, I one of the ways that I work is I listen to a lot of podcasts, and I listen to endless numbers of podcasts about also, the awesome impact that AI has, for example, in optimizing transportation, reducing whale strikes, for example, amongst shipping, those sorts of things, optimizing energy consumption, monitoring deforestation. So there are lots of great ways that AI is really supporting keeping track of what's happening to the environment. But there are also significant adverse impacts. And I think that, as we think about AI, we do need to think about that, and I want to talk about some of them in detail, but in general, they fall into a couple of basic categories. There's the increased electricity use, which results in greater carbon emissions. Water is a huge and often overlooked things, but there's also the impact of the hardware and the kinds of work that has to go into creating all these servers and all these chips, particularly around heavy metals and the transportation of these products. I did read a statistic about, it takes 800 kilograms of materials to produce a 2 kilogram heavy server. So we're talking sort of giant amounts of movement and transportation here as this demand goes up. We're also talking about what happens when they're no longer usable, and in terms of the e-waste out there. So there are a lot of ways that our increased hunger and usage of AI is driving adverse environmental impacts out there. The biggest one, obviously, is increased energy usage. Drawing data from the International Energy Association, they, for whatever reason, link AI and crypto, which I wish they wouldn't do. But they anticipate that energy usage is going to double because of the increased emphasis on AI and crypto as well. So, it's drawing sort of huge amounts of power to drive these kinds of things. And as we use the tools more, there are a lot of like really cute little anecdotes or factoids around AI use and how much power things take. I'm sure you've all sort of seen some of them. One of the most common ones is about how doing a Google search, doing a search in ChatGPT consumes 10 times the amount of power that doing a similar search in Google does. That comes from a document, also again from the International Energy Association. But if you actually dig into it, it becomes a lot more complicated. That factoid, for example, comes from a blog post by Google back in 2009, talking about how much energy a Google search does. And so it's a bit more complicated. There's quite an interesting post, which I've linked to on the slide there, that, you can't easily make these assumptions. And part of the reason is, one is there aren't good metrics for measuring energy usage around the use of things like AI and general things like software searches. But things are changing so quickly as well. So metrics and change are two things that are dramatically affecting how much this thing. So it's very much a moving target, and you've got to be really careful. But certainly one thing that is undeniable is that greater energy usage by these endless numbers of new data centers that are being put out there are meaning more carbon in the atmosphere. A report by Morgan Stanley, no relation, unfortunately, found that between now and 2030, we're likely to have 3 times more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than if AI was not being used. So certainly there's going to be a really profound impact on the environment if we continue to use AI in the same way that we're using it at the moment. In thinking about how data centers, most AI is run by running large training models or large language models that are trained within a, and they're located within a data center. And as you use the tools, they're operating in these giant data centers with graphical processing cards going on there. It's one important thing to think about is that there are different levels of ways that these centers are affecting the environment here. So, there's the direct impact, or what is called scope 1 in the analysis. This is, the impact of the direct running of the facility. They perhaps have an emergency generator. So that's direct impact. But even more important than that are the indirect impacts. And you've got upstream and downstream indirect impacts as well. So, you've got the electricity that is required to run the data center, as sort of an important part of that. But you've also got the sort of things that go into the data center. So the supply chain in terms of getting the materials there, getting the servers there, getting the chips there, the transportation that is involved in that. You've got the e-waste and the supply chain in terms of getting things out of there. And it's not just carbon that is affecting the environment, but it's also other things as well, like methane, hydrofluorocarbons, and other sorts of gases out there. So as we're thinking about that, bear in mind that you've got these three different scopes, both direct and indirect, and you've got to sort of think about the whole thing, because too often we just think about that single direct impact. And many corporations are starting to feel the impact of the shift to AI and how it's affecting their own goals. So, companies like Microsoft, which, had some environmental goals, some sustainability goals, um, they're finding, like in 2023, their emissions increased by almost a third compared to their base year of 2020. So instead of heading in the right direction in terms of reducing them, they find that they're going out, reducing them. And we see this in many of the large corporations that report sustainability data as part of being a public company. So, they're increasingly missing their goals as they try and hit them there. Um, as I mentioned, one thing that people often neglect when they are talking about the environmental impact of AI is increased water usage. An enormous amount of water is required to cool the machines in the data center, and it's estimated by a couple of academics who have studied this, that by 2027 global AI use will use as much water as the entire country of Denmark. So it's very big. Um, just to give you a sense, there's a Google data center in Oregon that now consumes about 25% of the entire water consumption of that small town. And, in some particular areas of the world, I live in Salt Lake City, which is a desert, as we sometimes forget, but, water is a real problem in many parts of the world. And so there's also an issue of equity in terms of where these data centers are located, and how much water in terms of the actual population is happening there. So there are big environmental impacts in terms of usage of AI, which is not to say that AI is not becoming more energy efficient. Certainly it is. This is a graph which, oh, Siri wants to intervene. Um, uh, this is a graph from AI. Okay. Okay, I found this on the web. She's ignoring my do not disturb notion. It's from Ernst & Young or EY, which shows, a nice sort of graphical sense of the ways that large language models are becoming more energy efficient as people figure out different ways of doing things and going forward. And it's happening because of a range of different kinds of things. So we've got more efficient data cooling centers. There's been almost a 100% improvement in that thing there in terms of how they're able to cool using direct-to-chip methods and those kinds of innovations. We're seeing a more efficient chip architecture, and just generally more efficient data centers and hardware, more emphasis on using renewables. And if you go back to that International Energy Association chart, you'll see that in general there is a good trajectory in terms of more renewable energy and less reliance on coal and things like that. The big question is about the role of nuclear power plants. You know, 3 Mile Island is slated to be reopened. There are plans to reopen it here. They've opened a couple of new ones, I believe, in Canada, particularly in response to drought conditions affecting the supply of hydroelectricity and those sorts of things. But in general, there is more emphasis on more sustainable energy models, and that is all good news. There's also better metrics coming, and so in Europe they just launched, you know, they got registered with the International Study as a Standards Organization, the first real reliable method for measuring the carbon emissions of software. And this is a huge thing. It seems like, you know, like, great, there's a metric there, but part of the challenge has been getting people to figure out how to figure out what they're actually using and to compare with uh, earlier periods. So having a really reliable metric is a huge thing. We're starting to see more action around green software design as well, sometimes called green software design. Another phrase that you're likely to hear more often is called DevSusOps, so like DevOps, but with an emphasis on sustainability. So ways of designing software to make it more sustainable. And I think that'll become more of an emphasis going forward, and we'll see some great sort of advances there. So there is definitely forward progress and movement, and things are starting to get a lot better. As part of that, though, also awareness about the environmental impact is beginning to register among international organizations and even corporations, just not very much in the higher ed or in the EdTech sort of space. But for example, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development has a set of principles, right at the top of which is, you know, it includes the usual kinds of things that EdTech companies are focusing on, but includes a focus right at the top of the list on sustainable development and well-being. And these are starting to become more influential as places sort of go forward. The European Union introduced the Artificial Intelligence Act recently. You know, the general purpose of that is to make AI safe. In the European Union, they classify AI usage in terms of, is it unacceptable? Things like social scoring and the use in various kinds of tracking kinds of ways, or high, limited, minimal use. It's actually a pretty nice act. It also includes an Article 40, which establishes a framework for at least starting to think about the environment, to try and measure AI's environmental impact, understand its importance, understand its usage of resources, and to try and make it more efficient. So it's a real, you know, a lot of people are disappointed with it, but it establishes a real, uh, at least a start in terms of thinking about the sustainability. In terms of other countries, Australia also came out with a statement of AI ethics that includes much more focus on the environment as well. You know, they're there, but there are two components where the environment is taken into. And I want to draw attention in particular to, you know, the benefit of individuals. And we're starting to see something here, which is, I think, a balance or a trade-off. So you've got the kinds of things that AI brings you, the kinds of capabilities and possibilities, but you've also got to trade off with the environment. You know, like with every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. With every usage of a technology, it has benefits, but it also has an impact, and you need to really think about that. And the Australian Code of Ethics, I think, is a pretty nice one in terms of people starting to see the ways that AI needs to be thought of in this holistic way as being part of a larger ecosystem in which the environment is one of the components. It's not just governments, but Ernst & Young, I used a chart of theirs earlier, but they also in their own code of ethics, and in terms of thinking about responsible AI, they have a really nice approach where sustainability is right up there, along with data protection, accountability, reliability, the same kinds of things that we see in vendors who sell to higher ed. Sustainability is right up there, and one of the sort of core things that they're paying attention to. Um, and as they write about it, they draw attention again to this idea of this balance, that there's risks and there's advantages, and we need to really sort of think about that they address front and center the fact that these companies, it's hard for them, I think, uh, to figure out, because things are moving so quickly and so complicated, and there aren't good laws in place right now. So they sort of really think about the challenges inherent in that. And to me, that was a really sort of striking aspect. So to compare what we're sort of seeing in these international organizations and the broader organizations of things, there's much more of a focus on sustainability, starting to grapple with the issues, even though it's complicated by the lack of metrics, by the lack of clear law, by the fact that the space is moving so much. But there's this effort to really balance and sort of think about impact and how it's affecting the environment. Whereas in EdTech, I'm afraid, and in higher ed in general, there's been much less of a focus. No sense that there are trade-offs or how to make them. One of my criticisms of the EdTech standards from around the responsible use of AI is that they're like motherhood and apple pie. It's really hard to disagree with them. There's nothing in there that anybody would sort of disagree with. And I think it's hard to talk about responsibility or ethics if there's no hard choices involved. If it's something that you should be doing anyway, how much of a guide is it? And no sort of appreciation of the changing and dynamic and emerging nature of the space. So I think EdTech is really lagging behind there. I think the intentions of the companies, the intentions of the institutions are great. They certainly want to do the right thing, but I think they're lagging behind some of the other organizations. Um, I think there's some real problems there. Again, um, the cynical part of me, as I look at those EdTech codes of ethics, it sort of reminds me. I have a good friend who's British, and like many British folks, he often uses the phrase, "if I'm honest." And I always want to say, hey, does that mean that what you were saying before was not based in honesty? It sort of reminds me a bit of the joke that Tony and I have. But why is this specific to EdTech? Surely they should be thinking about privacy, about transparency, about reliability, about security, and it shouldn't be EdTech specific. So that's just one sort of cynical criticism of them. But more profoundly, I think a lot of the EdTech AI guidelines that we talked about earlier are very inward looking. It's all about the EdTech itself and what's actually happening within the system itself, rather than thinking about the ways that it may be affecting the larger world in which we operate. It's very risk oriented, so it's all about ways that edtech can, or AI use in edtech can cause problems in a way, just and particular problems for the company more than things. So things like privacy, and it's about limiting risk. It's also very reactive rather than thinking, okay, what are we doing here? How are things being used? And what might the future look like? So it's very defensive and reactive. So I have some sort of real problems with that. But I also particularly have a problem because it assumes that AI use is a given. I think that's a sort of core principle underlying all of those EdTech AI responsible use guidelines, is they assume you're going to use AI and EdTech, and that it's going to be okay. And I think that's a real problem because they never ever really think about non-use. Um, and non-use seems like an odd sort of thing to think about, but we're starting to see it. So, for example, in the library world, one of the things that libraries have been engaged in for a long time is digital preservation, figuring out ways to preserve digital artifacts like data sets and other sorts of collections. But one of the conversations that's starting to happen in libraries at the moment is our conversations about, hey, do we really need to preserve this? So if we do digital preservation, there's a cost because data is not free, and certainly with large research data sets, the costs are significant. But there's also an environmental cost as well because it's being stored in a data center, it's consuming all that electricity, it's being checked on a regular basis. So there are costs, and so libraries are starting to have these conversations about, well, there's a trade-off here. We preserve something, but should it be preserved? And I think we need to start having similar kinds of conversations in edtech and in higher education around AI. Should we be using this? And just to another disclaimer, I'm an avid user of AI myself, and I think there's some sort of amazing things that can be done around student success and helping helping learning as well as making processes more efficient. So I'm very pro AI, but I think we do need to have a broader and more expansive concept of responsible use, which needs to include this conversation about should it be used or should it not be used. In talking about the use of AI, Virginia Dignam has a great book out there where she distinguishes between responsible use and ethics. She sees ethics as much more about morals and values, while responsibility is the practical application. Um, I think it's a useful thing to think about. I don't actually agree with it. I have a maybe a broader concept of ethics, but it's one that others share, which they're about telling you what's right and wrong, about really thinking through actions and deciding, should I do something, should I not do something? It's also about constraining behavior. So I'm actually okay with ethics, but there is this distinction between responsibility and ethics, and some people fall down on that responsibility thing. Going back to Australia, though, there is actually a very nice definition which I've landed up using. It's the practice of developing responsible AIs using AI systems that provides benefits to wider society while minimizing the risk of negative consequences. And we've got some Australian spelling in there um, of minimizing, but it's a nice simple definition that I think is useful to think about. Okay, we've got these benefits coming, but there are also risks, and we need to sort of really think about them and maybe make decisions about not using AI in cases where uh, the risks outweigh the benefits here. So we need to move from this concept of, we certainly need privacy and security in the use of AI. We need transparency. We need humans in the loop. And my only wish is that people would be more you know, strict about that. But we also need to ask questions about, is AI beneficial in the circumstances? What are the upstream and downstream impacts of it? We need to sort of think through it more clearly, and should it be used at all? And I want to be sort of clear here that it's not just about making AI more efficient. So often the arguments out there are about, um, we should use AI, we should just make it more efficient. And I think we need to go beyond that. I think it needs to be a broader conversation that is not just about making it more efficient, but also should it be used at all? Um, and part of that is because I think AI sprawl is becoming a problem in edtech and in education more generally. Part of my thinking here was I last year in June I went to a big conference called Infocom, um, which is the big audio visual and facilities conference around using technology in like in classrooms and things like that. And something that struck me at the time was that every single product I looked at had AI embedded in it. And some of this makes sense. So, for example, there were conference systems that would do automatic translations using AI. Some of that makes sense, or conference systems that would use AI to make the sound quality better, or things like that. But there were also lots of things like TV screens that would go in a classroom where they had embedded AI so that you could actually chat GPT within the screen. Um, or ask Claude something within the actual screen. And I think that struck me as an example of sort of AI sprawl. You don't need that kind of interaction with every kind of uh, piece of hardware that you have. So I think we're starting to see, as places integrate AI, we're starting to see this AI sprawl, and I think it's a problem. I think it'll come, we'll have a bit of a reckoning in the future as the real costs of AI in terms of just the financial costs come, and places have to actually pay the real amount uh for these services, and pass those on to end users. We'll probably see fewer of these AI enabled smart screens, and things like that. So I think AI is going to be ubiquitous, but I think at the moment we're seeing a lot of AI sprawl. A lot of it also got summed up for me. I was talking with a vendor uh, who has been using AI for a long time in a student success tool that he sells. And he said there's sort of such a huge shift in how he would speak to higher education. For a while there, he would try and soft pedal the AI because it was a bit scary, and people didn't know what it meant. This is pre-2023. But now, whenever he goes to sell the product, all the institutions want to know is, no, no, just tell me about the AI, and where can I sign up for this? So there's this rush to buy things, and rush to include AI in everything. And I think that's a problem. What can you do about this? And how can you approach developing a responsible use of AI? One thing I would encourage you to do as institutions is develop your own sets of AI principles, and approach them as though they are a live document and a growing document, because things are changing a lot. But I would really encourage you to sort of think about ways that you should really think about AI in your own institutions. I do look at a lot of AI policies that higher ed institutions have adopted, and a lot of the time there isn't that more philosophical approach to it. It's more concerned with the nuts and bolts. But I think there needs to be this sort of sense of what is a responsible use, and where do we draw the boundaries as an institution. As doing part of that, I would really encourage you to be as broad in your thinking as possible. Bring in different stakeholders into the conversation to have that conversation. One of the ways that some of the better sets of guidelines that I highlighted, it's striking how much more inclusive they were in how they drew up those things. The smaller the group, the worse are the sets of principles. So I'd really encourage you to really think about who the stakeholders are, and to engage them. For anybody that is interested, I also have a neat little uh, a toolkit about how to identify stakeholders that can be useful, because often that's overlooked. I think you have a lot of power as higher education, so start to work with your EdTech vendors and the people that you're buying AI from to really revisit their principles, and to start to include a responsible use component to those. Many of you are on advisory boards, you can use your positions there, but I think the pressure is going to come from higher ed to shape the conversation uh, with vendors, and don't underestimate how much power you have there. Also, work with your professional organizations, EduCause, Can Height, the conference, uh, the CIO groups, whatever professional organizations you've got there. Start to sort of have conversations, start to put proposals in around conferences. There needs to be much more attention to that. within higher ed, because it's really been neglected. I think, and I hesitate to say this because I see lots of really bad RFPs, but start to incorporate a concept of AI use into procurement. I don't have a great example of how to do that yet, but I think that is a way to do that, to ask vendors, as you're buying AI tools, what steps are you taking to make sure that you're using AI in a responsible way, using the best kind of energy efficiency, making smart decisions about where to use and where to not use AI. I think that needs to be a part of a procurement conversation, in the same way as that's how accessibility became much more powerful and much more adhered to. I think we need to sort of start seeing the environment and sustainability come into procurement in that way. And finally, combat AI sprawl at your institution. Make smart choices. Don't use it just because it's AI. There's a lot of AI washing, in a way, because it's sort of it's shiny and people want it. But I think there are smart ways that higher ed can drive that conversation towards a more responsible use, and I think it needs to be done. Um, so with that, I'm going to close it up for discussion. And looks like there's a lot of questions. There certainly were a lot of questions in the chat. Do feel free to reach out at me. I've got my email here. I write a newsletter called On EdTech. Encourage you to go read it. Cover all kinds of EdTech, online learning, learning management systems. I'm also on Blue Sky and on LinkedIn. So keep in touch.
Great. Thank you very much, Morgan. Do you want me to read out the questions, or did you want to pull them up from the Q?
Yeah, you read them out. That's
Okay.
a better.
Sounds good. All right. So the first one, is there a metric framework, etc., measuring the environmental impact of ed tech companies, a bit like we have for appliances, because AI is unavoidable in education, and how can we choose more wisely or more responsibly?
So it's like an Energy Star.
Yes.
Or yeah, no, that's a great idea. There's not one at the moment. And in part, the metrics are still just so emergent generally, even outside of EdTech. And it's really hard um, to actually figure out where things are. So, you know, something that I didn't talk about, but which some places are starting to introduce, like Amazon, for example, they have model cards. So, they're using a particular large language model and they list all the assumptions and implications on a card. I think we could maybe put pressure on edtech companies to start to do that, so a learning management system, for example, okay, they're using this kind of language model in these kinds of data centers, and things like that. But even public companies that are writing ESG reports, they don't sort of really go into that. So it's going to be a long slog. But that would be awesome if we had an Energy Star for edtech companies. Something to think about for the future and something to fight for, but it's going to be a long slog.
Absolutely. Okay, next question. Thanks, Glenda, for a very interesting point on the non-use of AI. However, one of the fundamental issues in AI use in higher education seems to be that it is already impossible to ban the usage of it. That's why higher education institutions are currently focusing on enhancing AI literacy and rethinking assessment to address the issue. I wonder what your thoughts are on this.
Yeah, no, I realize it's a tough thing, and uh I certainly think banning things is counterproductive, and I'm opposed to that. Uh Although, I think in a perverse way, banning things makes them more popular, which is the only thing that stops me from being really depressed about book bans. It's like, wow, you've made those books that that you've banned really, really, every teenager in the world now wants to get their hands on that book and read it. The same with AI. But I think there is a difference between going completely gung ho about we must have AI in everything, and sort of really sort of thinking about how to use it, and where to be, and I think sort of calling vendors out when there is a somewhat gratuitous use of AI. I think that is one sort of way to start, because I think even though in the large sort of, just one particular little search isn't going to make a lot of difference, but I think if we actually sort of say, what's the benefit here? Do we really need that? Um, and sort of questioning that. So rather than a full-on ban, rather than, say, do we really need to have that particular feature in a tool? So going back to my example of the screens, the in classroom screens that have a built-in chatbot and a built-in interface with Claude or with ChatGPT, do we really need that? Are we just recreating an energy inefficient smart board that is going to sit in the corner and die like all the other smart boards have in higher education? So I think sort of it's small steps, but I think sort of having those conversations are doing that rather than banning. I think banning is definitely the I I I agree with you. That's the wrong way to go.
Okay. A question from Erica. Do you have examples of helpful, responsible use clauses?
The best ones, and I did read through tons of them. The best ones are like the Australian AI principles. I do like I do like the Ernst and Young ones, which was surprising to me. But the ones that are in the deck are the ones that I found useful. So I would encourage you to sort of check those out. Um, uh, and after a while you sort of start to see the same thing. So I think if you look at those sort of the ones that I've included here, those are the ones that I liked better. And then that Australian definition of responsible AI use. So I think it's clear, it's simple, balancing advantages with the disadvantages. And I think that's sort of what we need to start seeing in both institutional policies and in edtech company policies as well.
All right, thank you for that. Okay, this I have another one here for you. Thanks, Glenda, for such an insightful presentation. I was wondering if you could comment on the ethical responsibility for AI-related adverse impacts, which falls more heavily on consumers who often lack technical expertise and regulatory power rather than on the corporations and developers who design, train, and deploy these systems. There seems to be an imbalance in terms of ethical expectations. Quite the question there.
So if I'm right, the question is saying that at the moment everything falls on the person actually buying it.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think that's true, uh and some of what I just argued was, hey, it's all up to you. You should be coming up with your own sets of principles and putting pressure on vendors. That that is an unfortunate thing, but I think it's the only way we're going to start to sort of see change, I think. Um, I think we need to uh, indicate to the people that we're buying the products from that this is something that higher ed is interested in, and something that they want to be there, and it's something that they need to be honest about. You know, uh, somebody mentioned about in the Energy Star question. It would be great to have an Energy Star rating for EdTech products. And I sort of said it was going to be a hard slog because mostly they're not prepared to be that transparent about what they're doing. I think turn that argument on themselves. One of their principles that they've already committed to is transparency. Surely they should be being transparent about what AI they're using, what that environmental impact should be. So I think use that argument. Unfortunately, it does mean, yeah, that we as end consumers, higher ed needs to put pressure on vendors. But I think the vendors, for the most part, really actually do want to do the right thing here. They care about it too. Certainly, many of them have committed to environmental concerns. So I think it's also just a process of education. So
All right. I have one more question here. It's a little abstract. So I'll let you try your best at this one, Morgan. AI, this is from Boris. AI is a small part of the digitalization of society. Why should we slow down the implementation of AI against the background of the general increase in the use of computers? Or is the whole society going in the wrong direction? Or is it going too fast?
that's that's a big one. I mean, I think sort of part of what I was trying to argue, and the problem is that the metrics are so bad, but AI has radically increased the environmental impact of technology. I think that is undeniable. If you look at, I mentioned Microsoft, their emissions are 30% higher than where they wanted them to be, or where they were 5 years ago. Uh, if you look at that Morgan Stanley report, everything points to the fact that AI has intensified the environmental impact of technology. So the environmental impact of technology, I think, was already an issue. And, prior to the big burst of AI on the scene, people were talking about green IT and ways to make data centers more efficient and things like that. But the issue has become more intense and more urgent because of the explosion and usage of AI and the way that has driven, these large language models are just more resource intensive, both to train them and to run them. Because if you think about all the, all the things that all the computing that has to happen in the background for my query of Chat GPT about, what, uh, you know, what should I be doing if I travel to London next week, or whatever, something like that. I think it's made it more urgent. I'm not an AI doomer. I also think it's pointless to try and shut the door on it. But I think we can make better choices. It's about balance and trade-offs. It's not all or nothing. And I think that's sort of essentially what I'm asking for is let's have some actual conversations about trade-off and make hard decisions sometimes.
Great answer. That was a tricky question. I don't see any more in the Q&A. I was just looking at the chat. I don't see any there. So without, I won't hold up any longer. So I'll just want to thank you very much, Morgan, for such an insightful and thought-provoking webinar on the intersection of AI, environmental sustainability, and higher education. Your discussion shed some much needed light on the often overlooked environmental impact of AI. So thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us on that. And a big thank you to all of our participants for attending and engaging with your thoughtful questions and interactions in the chat. Just a reminder that the recording for today's session and presentation slides will be available on Teach Online shortly after the recording processes. And you will also receive a link through your email in about 24 hours, I believe it sends it out. And if you have any further questions or feedback, feel free to reach out. We appreciate your time and hope to see you at our next Contact North webinar, which will be next Wednesday, February 26th at 1 o'clock Eastern Time. We are presenting the digital transformation at Canadian higher education institutions, findings from the 2024 Pan-Canadian Report, hosted by Nicole Johnson, the Executive Director at the Canadian Digital Learning Research Association. So thank you, everyone. Have a great day. And thank you so much, Morgan. We'll see everybody later.
Thank you, Sarah. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.